Just smile and call me your wife. Daniel Carter nearly dropped the glass of sparkling water in his hand. Excuse me. For one dinner. Rebecca Hayes kept her voice low, her calm blue eyes fixed on the elegant woman crossing the ballroom toward them. Trust me. Daniel stared at his chief executive officer as if she had just suggested they announce a merger with the moon. Around them, nearly 200 guests filled the downtown Chicago hotel ballroom, where crystal lights reflected across white tablecloths and polished silverware. A jazz trio played softly near the stage. Daniel could hear Sophie beside him carefully opening the paper wrapper around a dinner roll, completely unaware that her father's professional life had just taken a very strange turn. Rebecca, I cannot pretend you are my wife. You do not have to pretend anything beyond dinner. That is still pretending. Rebecca finally looked at him. For a woman who could silence a boardroom with one measured sentence, there was something unexpectedly human in her expression now. Concern, not for herself, for him, and perhaps even more for the 10-year-old girl standing between them. Less than a minute earlier, Rebecca had helped Sophie straighten the small ribbon on her navy dress after it caught against the back of a chair. Victoria Lang, one of the company's most influential investors, had witnessed the moment from across the ballroom and apparently reached the wrong conclusion. There is the Carter family, Victoria had called warmly. Daniel, you never told me your wife was Rebecca Hayes. Daniel had opened his mouth immediately. Rebecca had touched his sleeve and whispered, wait. Now Victoria was less than 20 feet away. Why not just correct her? Daniel asked. Rebecca glanced at Sophie. Two nearby executives were already watching them with amused curiosity. Daniel understood before Rebecca answered. Correcting Victoria was simple. Explaining why a single father had brought his daughter to a formal corporate dinner was not. His babysitter had canceled 40 minutes before he needed to leave. Staying home would have meant missing the most important client dinner of his year. Bringing Sophie had been his only reasonable choice. Yet Daniel knew how quickly reasonable choices became evidence against people others had already decided to underestimate. He was the man who left at 5:15. The man who declined late drinks because he had school pickup the next morning. The man some executives quietly described as dependable but unavailable. Rebecca knew it too. I am trying to keep Sophie from becoming tonight's conversation, she said softly. Daniel looked down. Sophie was studying them now. Dad, why are you making your worried face? I have a worried face? You definitely have a worried face. Rebecca almost smiled. Then Victoria reached them. Rebecca. She embraced the chief executive officer with practiced warmth before turning toward Daniel. Now this makes sense. I always wondered why you two seem to understand each other so well. Daniel felt every instinct telling him to correct the misunderstanding. Dignity, after all, was not supposed to require a lie. Rebecca seemed to read the conflict on his face. She could have protected herself. She could have laughed and stepped away. Instead, she looked directly at Victoria and said, Daniel does make life interesting. Victoria smiled. Sophie blinked. Daniel stopped breathing for half a second. Then Victoria gestured toward the dinner tables. Wonderful. You three are sitting with me. As they followed her, Daniel leaned toward Rebecca. One dinner, she promised. Sophie walked between them, then quietly slipped one hand into her father's. A moment later, to Rebecca's surprise, the girl reached for hers too. Rebecca looked down at their joined hands. Daniel noticed the change in her expression, but neither of them said anything. They had agreed to pretend to be a family for one evening. What none of them understood yet was that the dangerous part would not be making strangers believe it. The dangerous part would be how quickly the three of them stopped feeling like strangers. 10 hours earlier, Daniel Carter had been standing barefoot in his kitchen, spreading peanut butter across 2 pieces of toast while Sophie searched for a missing science worksheet. Dad, it was on the table. Everything is on the table until we need it. That is not helpful. Neither is losing your homework. Morning light barely touched the windows of their modest townhouse outside Chicago, and the coffee maker sounded louder than it should have at 6:45. Daniel wore charcoal slacks and a white dress shirt, but his tie still hung over the back of a chair. Sophie appeared from beneath the kitchen table holding the worksheet like buried treasure. Daniel smiled. This was his world before conference calls, quarterly reports, and people measuring ambition by how late someone stayed beneath fluorescent lights. At 39, Daniel had spent 6 years raising Sophie alone. He did not talk about sacrifice because, to him, fatherhood was not a sacrifice. It was a promise. At Hayes Global, Daniel managed operations for one of the company's fastest-growing regional divisions. His performance reviews were consistently strong. His projects finished on schedule. His teams trusted him. Yet one detail followed him through the office like a quiet accusation. Daniel left at 5:15 whenever he could. 5:15 meant reaching Sophie's after-school program before 6. 5:15 meant dinner at home instead of another restaurant meeting. 5:15 meant being there when his daughter needed help understanding fractions or remembering which planet had the rings. Some colleagues respected it. Others translated it into a word Daniel had learned to dislike: unavailable. At 9:30 that morning, Rebecca Hayes entered a leadership meeting carrying a folder of quarterly performance reports. She was 41, composed, precise, and known for remembering numbers other executives needed spreadsheets to find. Daniel had spoken with her perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. She knew his work better than she knew him. Carter's division beat forecast again, one executive said. His retention numbers are excellent, Rebecca replied. Another man leaned back in his chair. Good manager. Not sure about senior leadership. Rebecca looked up. Why? The man hesitated. Availability. Rebecca closed the folder slowly. His results appear available. Nobody answered. Daniel never learned about that conversation. At 4:20 that afternoon, he received a text message that changed his evening. His babysitter had developed a fever and could not come. Daniel stared at the message, then at the formal dinner invitation beside his keyboard. The event began at 7. Victoria Lang would be there, along with investors, senior executives, and the client team Daniel had spent 4 months helping prepare. Missing the dinner could confirm every assumption he hated. Leaving Sophie alone was not an option. He called 3 people. Nobody was available. At 5:12, he finally walked into Rebecca's office. I need to miss tonight. Rebecca looked up from her laptop. Problem. My sitter canceled. Bring your daughter. Daniel blinked. To the investor dinner? It is dinner, Daniel, not a Senate hearing. Victoria Lang will be there. Victoria has grandchildren. Daniel almost laughed. That does not make this less strange. Rebecca studied him for a moment. You did the work that put half the people in that ballroom tonight. You should not disappear because you are also somebody's father. Daniel left her office with something he had not expected: respect. 2 hours later, Sophie entered the ballroom in a navy dress, holding Daniel's hand and trying very hard to look grown-up. Rebecca saw them from across the room. For the first time, she was not looking at Daniel Carter's performance numbers. She was watching him kneel to fix his daughter's crooked shoe strap, listen carefully to something she whispered, and make her laugh before standing again. Rebecca had spent years learning how successful people behaved when important people were watching. Daniel was doing something different. He was showing Sophie that she was important even when everyone else was watching. And before the night was over, that small distinction would change everything. Rebecca had attended enough corporate dinners to know that most conversations began before anyone opened their mouth. The watch, the suit, the table assignment, the person standing beside you. All of it became evidence in a room where people were always measuring one another. Yet, when she watched Daniel enter the ballroom with Sophie holding his hand, none of those measurements seemed useful. You actually brought her, Rebecca said when they reached her. Daniel adjusted his tie. I considered leaving her with the coat check, but apparently that is discouraged. Sophie looked up at Rebecca. He is joking. I hope so. He does that when he is nervous. Daniel sighed. Thank you, Sophie. Rebecca smiled before she could stop herself. It surprised her. Most evenings like this were predictable. She arrived alone, discussed revenue over appetizers, answered questions through dessert, and returned to a quiet condominium overlooking downtown Chicago. Her refrigerator contained expensive sparkling water, mustard, and very little that qualified as dinner. Success had given Rebecca choices, but somewhere along the way, it had also given her an extraordinary number of empty evenings. She rarely admitted that, even to herself. Sophie, meanwhile, had no interest in titles. Are you really the chief executive officer? She asked. I am. So you are Dad's boss? Technically. Sophie considered that. Does that mean you can make him stop checking email during breakfast? Daniel nearly coughed. Rebecca turned toward him. He does that. Sophie, you said honesty matters. Rebecca laughed softly. Your daughter makes a compelling argument. Before Daniel could recover, a server passed behind Sophie, and the girl stepped aside too quickly. The ribbon at the back of her navy dress caught against the chair. "Hold still," Rebecca said. She carefully freed the fabric and straightened the ribbon. "There." Sophie turned around. "Thank you." "You are welcome." It was an ordinary gesture, almost forgettable, except Victoria Lang happened to see it from across the ballroom. Rebecca noticed Victoria smiling as she began walking toward them. "There is the Carter family," Victoria called. "Daniel, you never told me your wife was Rebecca Hayes." Daniel immediately opened his mouth. "Actually, Victoria, Rebecca is not." Rebecca touched his sleeve. "Wait." He looked at her. "Why?" Two executives standing nearby had already turned toward them. Sophie glanced between the adults, suddenly aware that something awkward had happened. Rebecca understood the room instantly. Correcting Victoria would take 5 seconds. The questions afterward could take the entire evening. Why had Daniel brought his daughter? Where was Sophie's mother? Was childcare interfering with work again? People who would never ask a married executive to justify having children might suddenly make Daniel explain his entire life beside a dinner table. Rebecca leaned closer. "Just smile and call me your wife." Daniel stared at her. "That is your solution? For one dinner. That is a terrible solution. Do you have a better one before Victoria gets here?" Daniel looked at Sophie. The girl was pretending to study the flowers on the table, but her small shoulders had tightened. His expression changed. Rebecca saw the exact moment his pride stepped aside for his daughter's comfort. "One dinner," he whispered. "One dinner," Rebecca agreed. Victoria reached them smiling, and Rebecca felt something unfamiliar beneath her practiced composure. She had made billion-dollar decisions with less hesitation than this. Yet when Sophie quietly reached for her hand moments later, Rebecca forgot about Victoria, the investors, and every carefully managed impression in the ballroom. The child's hand was warm and trusting. Rebecca looked toward Daniel, expecting discomfort. Instead, she saw gratitude. Not because she was his chief executive officer. Not because she had power. Simply because, for one difficult moment, she had made his daughter feel safe. And Rebecca suddenly wondered when anyone had last needed something from her that money, authority, or a job title could not provide. By the time the first course arrived, Daniel had learned that pretending to be married required far more information than either of them had considered. "So how long have you two been together?" Victoria asked. Daniel reached for his water. Rebecca reached for hers. Sophie looked delighted. "That depends on what you mean by together," Daniel said carefully. Rebecca gave him a warning glance. Victoria laughed. "Still joking after marriage. Impressive." Sophie covered her mouth, but Daniel could see the smile behind her hand. They were seated at a round table near the center of the ballroom, surrounded by investors and senior executives who knew Rebecca as a disciplined chief executive officer and Daniel as a reliable operations manager. Nobody knew what to make of them as husband and wife. Unfortunately, Sophie knew exactly what to make of it. "Rebecca," she whispered, loudly enough for Daniel to hear, "Dad does not like mushrooms." Rebecca glanced at Daniel's plate. "Good to know. He also puts too much cinnamon in oatmeal." "That is subjective," Daniel said. "It is not." Rebecca lowered her voice. "Anything else I should know about my husband?" Sophie thought seriously. "He sings in the car when he thinks I am asleep." Daniel closed his eyes. "I am reconsidering bringing you." For the first time that evening, Rebecca laughed without measuring how it might sound. The warmth of it surprised Daniel. He had heard her speak to hundreds of employees, negotiate difficult contracts, and answer investors without hesitation. He had never heard her laugh like that. Victoria turned toward another guest, giving them a brief moment alone. "You are enjoying this," Daniel murmured. "More than I expected. My daughter is destroying my professional reputation." "Your professional reputation needed personality." "That sounds like feedback I should document." Rebecca smiled again. The strange thing was how quickly they found a rhythm. When Victoria asked where they spent weekends, Daniel answered honestly that Saturdays usually meant grocery shopping, soccer practice, and laundry. Rebecca added that Daniel apparently considered separating dark clothes from light clothes in advanced science. Sophie nodded solemnly. No elaborate lies. No invented anniversaries. They simply allowed everyone else to interpret ordinary truths through the misunderstanding already in place. Yet Rebecca began noticing details that had nothing to do with the performance. Daniel cut Sophie's chicken when she struggled with it. then continued listening to an investor without missing a sentence. When Sophie dropped her napkin, he replaced it before she asked. When an executive questioned whether Daniel's division could handle a demanding expansion schedule, Daniel answered calmly, without exaggerating his role or diminishing his team. Rebecca had known leaders who filled every silence because they feared being overlooked. Daniel seemed comfortable letting his work speak before he did. Halfway through dinner, Sophie leaned toward Rebecca. Can I ask you something? Of course. Do you always eat dinner this late? Rebecca glanced at the clock. It was nearly 8:30. Often. Sophie's eyebrows lifted. Who waits for you at home? The question landed more quietly than Sophie intended. Rebecca looked down at her plate. Nobody, usually. Sophie seemed genuinely confused. Not even a dog. Not even a dog. Daniel started to redirect the conversation, but Rebecca shook her head gently. She was not offended. She was simply unprepared. Sophie studied her for another moment, then pushed the small bread basket toward Rebecca. You can have my last roll. Rebecca stared at it. Around them, crystal glasses chimed and executives discussed numbers worth millions of dollars. Yet the smallest offer at the table somehow felt heavier than all of it. Thank you, Rebecca said softly. Sophie smiled and returned to her dinner. Daniel looked at Rebecca, and for several seconds neither spoke. The pretending had begun as protection from an awkward misunderstanding. But somewhere between Sophie's questions, Daniel's quiet patience, and a dinner roll offered without calculation, Rebecca realized she was no longer wondering whether they looked convincing. She was wondering why sitting beside them felt less lonely than going home. Do you ever get lonely when everybody goes home? Sophie asked. Rebecca stopped with her hand halfway toward her water glass. Daniel turned toward his daughter. Sophie. What? She said quietly. She said nobody waits for her. Rebecca could have escaped with a polished answer. She had spent years answering uncomfortable questions from investors, reporters, attorneys, and executives who searched every sentence for weakness. But Sophie was 10 years old. There was no strategy in her face, only concern. Sometimes, Rebecca admitted. Sophie leaned closer. Even when you are the boss. Rebecca smiled faintly. Being the boss does not make an empty apartment less empty. Daniel said nothing, but something in his expression softened. Around them, the ballroom continued humming with conversation. Silverware touched china. The jazz trio moved into a slower song. Somewhere near the stage, someone laughed too loudly at something that was probably not very funny. Yet their table seemed strangely removed from all of it. Sophie looked at Rebecca for several seconds. Dad gets lonely too. Daniel nearly dropped his fork. I think we have explored this subject enough. You told me people should not be embarrassed about feelings. I am beginning to regret teaching you so many principles. Rebecca laughed softly. She remembers your lessons. Every inconvenient one. Sophie smiled, but then her expression became serious again. He does not say he is lonely. He just cleans things. Rebecca raised an eyebrow. Cleans things. The kitchen. The garage. Sometimes the refrigerator when it is already clean. Sophie. I am helping. Daniel looked down at his plate, and Rebecca noticed that he was not angry. Embarrassed, perhaps, but not angry. There was grace in the way he allowed his daughter to see him as human without making her responsible for his emotions. That mattered. Rebecca had known powerful men who treated vulnerability like a debt someone else had to repay. Daniel carried his quietly. Your father seems to take good care of you, Rebecca said. Sophie nodded immediately. He always comes. Comes where? Everything. Sophie began counting on her fingers. Soccer games, parent conferences, science night, school concerts. He missed one field trip because of work, but he apologized about 11 times. 9, Daniel corrected. It was 11. Rebecca looked at him. You manage all that. Daniel shrugged. You manage a company. I have 12,000 employees. Exactly. I only have Sophie. The answer was simple, but Rebecca felt its weight. Daniel was not claiming that fatherhood was easy. He was saying Sophie was not an interruption to the important part of his life. She was the important part. Rebecca suddenly remembered the leadership meeting that morning. Good manager. Not sure about senior leadership. Availability. She remembered how easily people had reduced Daniel's choices to a professional limitation without asking what those choices revealed about his character. Dad makes pancakes every Sunday, Sophie continued. They are terrible, Daniel said. They are shaped weird. That is creativity. Last week one looked like Florida. Florida is a respected state. Rebecca covered a smile with her napkin. I would like to see these pancakes. Daniel looked at her. Careful. Sophie interprets statements like that as binding agreements. I do, Sophie confirmed. Then Victoria turned back toward them. Her expression had changed. The warmth remained, but there was calculation behind it now. Daniel, she said, Rebecca tells me your division may lead to Midwest expansion. Daniel glanced at Rebecca. That decision has not been made. No, Victoria replied. And senior leadership requires flexibility. Long hours. Travel. Sacrifice. Sophie lowered her eyes. Daniel noticed immediately. Rebecca did too. Victoria leaned forward. Tell me something. When the company needs you and your family needs you at the same time, who comes first? The table became quiet. Daniel could have given the answer everyone expected. He could have protected his career with one polished sentence. Instead, he placed his napkin beside his plate and looked Victoria calmly in the eye. Rebecca knew that look now. It was the same quiet dignity he carried when he left the office at 5:15, and she realized the pretending was about to become something far more dangerous than a misunderstanding. My family comes first, Daniel said. The silence that followed was so complete that even Sophie stopped moving. Victoria Lang studied him across the table. That is an unusual answer from someone being considered for senior leadership. Daniel did not look toward Rebecca for rescue. It should not be. Companies do not operate around school schedules. Neither do families operate around quarterly reports. Rebecca watched Victoria's expression sharpen, but Daniel's voice remained calm. There was no defiance in it, only certainty. If there is an emergency at work, I stay. If my team needs me, I answer. I have taken calls after midnight and solved problems on Sunday mornings. But if the question is whether I will miss my daughter's life simply to prove that I am ambitious, then no, I will not. Sophie looked down at her hands. Rebecca noticed the small smile she was trying to hide. Victoria leaned back. And you believe that makes you leadership material? I believe leadership is knowing the difference between what is urgent and what only wants to feel important. Nobody at the table spoke. Daniel could almost hear the sentence traveling through the minds around him. He knew it was not the safest answer. Safe answers had protected plenty of careers, but they had never raised a child. Rebecca had spent years surrounded by executives who competed over who arrived earliest and left latest. Some were extraordinary leaders. Others simply performed exhaustion as if it were evidence of commitment. Daniel was not performing anything. That was precisely what made his answer difficult to dismiss. Victoria turned toward Rebecca. And you agree with your husband? The word landed differently now. Daniel glanced at Rebecca. This was their opportunity to end the misunderstanding. Rebecca seemed to know it too. I agree that results matter more than theater, she said. Daniel's division exceeded forecast, improved retention, and completed the restructuring ahead of schedule. Victoria smiled slightly. That was not what I asked. I know. Then answer the question. Rebecca folded her hands. I think a person who keeps promises at home may understand something important about keeping promises at work. Daniel looked at her. For the first time that evening, there was nothing playful in his expression, only respect. Victoria nodded slowly, but her attention shifted toward Sophie. And what does your mother think about all these late-night calls? Sophie froze. Daniel felt the entire evening change. Rebecca's eyes moved immediately to the girl. Sophie looked at her father, confused. My mother? Victoria smiled. Rebecca. Sophie opened her mouth, then stopped. Daniel could see panic beginning to replace the easy confidence she had carried through dinner. That was the line. Whatever embarrassment followed belonged to the adults. He would not ask Sophie to lie for them. Victoria, Daniel said gently, maybe we should clear something up. Rebecca touched his wrist beneath the edge of the table, not to stop him this time, but to acknowledge that she understood. Daniel looked at her. She gave the smallest nod. Before he could continue, Victoria raised one hand. Not yet. Her tone was calm, but the warmth had disappeared. She turned toward Rebecca. How did you two meet? Daniel exhaled. Rebecca answered carefully. At work. Naturally. First date. Rebecca paused. Victoria. Where was it? I do not think that is relevant. Perhaps not. Victoria picked up her water glass. But it is interesting. Sophie looked from one adult to another. Daniel leaned toward Rebecca. We end this now. Rebecca nodded. Agreed. But Victoria was already watching them with the patient expression of someone who had noticed a loose thread and intended to keep pulling. How long have you been married? She asked. Daniel straightened. We have not. Rebecca turned toward him. Victoria's eyebrows lifted. Daniel continued before anyone could interrupt. Rebecca and I are not married. She is not Sophie's mother. There was a misunderstanding earlier, and we should have corrected it immediately. A nearby conversation faded as several people heard him. Daniel felt every eye turning toward their table, but his voice never changed. Sophie had nothing to do with it. If anyone deserves criticism, it is the adults. Rebecca looked at him with something deeper than gratitude. He had just placed truth above convenience when convenience might have helped his career. Then she turned to Victoria. Daniel is right about one thing. Sophie had nothing to do with this. But the decision to let the misunderstanding continue was mine. Victoria stared at them for several long seconds. Then, unexpectedly, she smiled. Good, she said. Daniel frowned. Good. Victoria set down her glass. Because I knew Rebecca was not your wife before the appetizers arrived. And suddenly Daniel understood that the questions had never been about marriage at all. You knew? Daniel asked. Victoria Lang gave him a calm look. Rebecca Hayes has been photographed at enough charity events and shareholder meetings that I would remember a secret husband and a 10-year-old daughter. Sophie lowered her eyes toward her plate, but Daniel gently placed his hand beside hers. You did nothing wrong, he said. Rebecca turned toward Victoria. Then why let this continue? Because I wanted to know why you did. Rebecca's expression tightened. That sounds like a test. It became one. The surrounding conversations slowly resumed, but several people at their table remained attentive. Victoria folded her napkin carefully. I watched you protect a child from embarrassment when correcting me would have protected your own image. Then I watched Daniel refuse to use your position to make himself look important. Those are unusual choices in rooms like this. Daniel shook his head. We still should have told the truth sooner. Yes, Victoria said. You should have. There was no cruelty in her answer, only clarity. Grace does not require pretending a mistake was not a mistake. Rebecca accepted the words without argument. The decision was mine, and ending it was his. Victoria looked at Daniel. Why? Daniel glanced at Sophie. Because my daughter was about to be asked to support a story she never agreed to tell. Sophie looked up at him. I could have helped. Daniel smiled gently. I know. That is exactly why I could not ask you. Rebecca felt those words settle somewhere deeper than the conversation. Daniel had been willing to risk embarrassment, professional judgment, perhaps even opportunity, simply because he refused to teach Sophie that convenience mattered more than truth. Victoria leaned back. This morning, I reviewed preliminary leadership recommendations for the Midwest expansion. Daniel's expression changed slightly. You reviewed those? I did. Your name was there. He said nothing. So was a concern about your availability. Rebecca's gaze sharpened. Based on what? Victoria looked toward another executive at the table. The man who had raised the same concern that morning suddenly became fascinated by his coffee. Late meetings, travel, family obligations. Daniel's jaw tightened, but his voice remained even. My performance record is available to anyone reviewing the position. I read it, Victoria said. That is why I asked you who comes first. Sophie looked worried again. Daniel squeezed her hand. And my answer probably removed me from consideration. No. Victoria's response came immediately. Daniel blinked. No. You answered the question I actually asked, not the one you thought would earn approval. She leaned forward. Companies need people who understand commitment. Too many confuse commitment with permanent availability. Rebecca looked at Daniel, but he did not smile. He was not looking for victory. He was simply listening. Victoria continued. You said leadership means knowing the difference between what is urgent and what only wants to feel important. I would like to hear more about that tomorrow, in a proper meeting, without anyone pretending to be married. Sophie whispered. That seems fair. Victoria laughed. Even Daniel could not stop a smile. Dinner slowly returned to normal. The tension dissolved into quieter conversation, and nobody asked Rebecca or Daniel to explain themselves again. When dessert arrived, Sophie announced that chocolate cake was more important than corporate expansion, and Victoria admitted she might have finally found a management principle she could support. Yet Rebecca barely tasted her coffee. Something had shifted. She had spent years believing respect came from being prepared, controlled, and impossible to embarrass. Daniel had just earned more respect by admitting an embarrassing truth than most people earned through a lifetime of polished appearances. When Sophie excused herself to wash her hands, Daniel stood to accompany her. Before leaving, he looked at Rebecca. "Thank you for trying to protect her." Rebecca shook her head. "You protected her. I complicated things." "Maybe." He paused. "But you stayed when walking away would have been easier." Then he followed Sophie across the ballroom. Rebecca watched them go. Victoria noticed. "Careful," she said quietly. Rebecca looked at her. "About what?" Victoria lifted her coffee. "The pretending is over." Rebecca turned back toward Daniel and Sophie. That should have made everything simpler. Instead, for the first time all evening, Rebecca wished it had lasted a little longer. When Daniel and Sophie returned to the table, the ballroom had begun to empty. Coats appeared over shoulders, handshakes replaced speeches, and the jazz trio played softly beneath the fading conversations. Sophie climbed into her chair and looked directly at Rebecca. "Are you still pretending?" Rebecca nearly laughed. "No, I think we officially retired from pretending." "Good." Sophie reached for the last bite of chocolate cake. It was getting complicated. Daniel sat beside her. "That may be the wisest thing anyone has said tonight." Victoria smiled and excused herself after reminding Daniel about their meeting the next morning. Soon only Rebecca, Daniel, and Sophie remained at the table. Without the misunderstanding protecting them, the space between Daniel and Rebecca felt strangely more noticeable. "I owe you an apology," Rebecca said. Daniel shook his head. "We both agreed." "You agreed because you were protecting Sophie. So were you. I also made your evening unnecessarily difficult." Daniel considered that. "You did." Rebecca blinked. Daniel smiled. "But you also defended me when you did not have to." Rebecca looked toward the nearly empty ballroom. "I should have done it sooner." "What do you mean?" She hesitated, then told him about the leadership meeting that morning. She told him someone had questioned his availability despite his results. Daniel listened without interrupting. "So people really do notice 5:15, he said. "Some people notice the wrong things. I knew there were assumptions. Why did you never challenge them?" Daniel looked at Sophie, who was carefully scraping chocolate frosting from her fork. "Because arguing about being a good father would make it sound like I needed permission to be one." Rebecca became quiet. There it was again, that dignity she had noticed all evening. Daniel did not demand respect by raising his voice. He simply refused to trade away the things that deserved respect in the first place. Outside the hotel, cool October air moved through downtown Chicago. Daniel buttoned Sophie's coat, while Rebecca waited beneath the entrance canopy for her car. "I am tired," Sophie announced. "That is what happens when you attend executive dinners," Daniel said. "Too much corporate strategy?" Rebecca asked. Sophie shook her head. "Too much cake." A black sedan stopped at the curb for Rebecca. She opened the rear door, then paused. "Daniel." "Yes." "Tomorrow, when you meet with Victoria, do not change your answer." Daniel looked surprised. "That might not be the best career advice. It is the only advice I am giving you as your chief executive officer tonight." "And the rest?" Rebecca glanced at Sophie. "The rest is from someone who thinks your daughter is lucky." Daniel's expression softened. "Thank you." Sophie stepped forward unexpectedly. "Rebecca?" "Yes." "You said nobody waits for you at home." Rebecca gave a small smile. "That is true." Sophie looked toward Daniel, then back at Rebecca. "You could come have pancakes Sunday." Daniel froze. "Sophie." "What?" She said she wanted to see them. Rebecca looked at Daniel. For perhaps the first time since he had known her, she seemed uncertain what the correct answer was. "You do not have to," Daniel said gently. "She invites people before consulting management." "You are management," Sophie said. Rebecca laughed. Then she looked at Daniel again. Would that be strange? He could have hidden behind workplace boundaries. He could have offered a polite excuse. Instead, he remembered Rebecca staring at a dinner roll as though kindness had caught her completely unprepared. "Probably," he said. Rebecca's smile faded slightly. Daniel continued. "But tonight was strange, and parts of it were not terrible." Sophie sighed dramatically. "Adults make everything difficult." Rebecca laughed again. "What time are these famous pancakes?" 9. Sophie answered before Daniel could speak. "Sunday morning." Rebecca nodded. "Then 9 it is." The sedan pulled away moments later, leaving Daniel and Sophie beneath the hotel lights. Sophie slipped her hand into his. "Dad." "Yes." "You like her?" Daniel stared straight ahead. "We are not discussing this." "That means yes." "That means it is late." Sophie smiled all the way to the parking garage. Inside the moving sedan, Rebecca watched the city lights pass across the window. Her phone displayed 12 unread messages, 3 calendar reminders, and a schedule crowded from morning until evening. For years, that screen had represented the life she had worked relentlessly to build. Tonight, for the first time, it looked strangely incomplete. She opened her calendar, found Sunday morning, and blocked out 2 hours. She typed only one word into the appointment: pancakes. Then she leaned back and smiled, because what had begun as a harmless performance was quietly becoming something neither of them could schedule, negotiate, or pretend away. 1 month later, Rebecca stood outside a small neighborhood restaurant at 7 o'clock on a Friday evening and realized she was more nervous than she had been before any board meeting in years. She had attended Sunday pancakes 3 times since the investor dinner. The first batch had, as Sophie promised, resembled several questionable states on a map. The second Sunday, Rebecca brought blueberries. By the third, Sophie had assigned her responsibility for the orange juice without asking anyone's permission. Nothing dramatic had happened. That was what made it matter. There had been homework spread across the kitchen table, coffee in mismatched mugs, stories about soccer practice, and Daniel apologizing whenever the smoke detector objected to his cooking. Rebecca had discovered that ordinary life could possess a warmth no luxury apartment could manufacture. Daniel had discovered something too. Rebecca did not arrive as his chief executive officer. She never discussed his promotion over pancakes, never offered favors, and never treated his life like a problem her money could solve. She simply showed up. Daniel's meeting with Victoria had gone well, but the Midwest leadership decision had remained exactly where it belonged, inside the company's formal review process. 3 weeks later, an independent leadership committee recommended Daniel for the role based on his performance, retention record, expansion plan, and team evaluations. When Rebecca received the recommendation, she removed herself from the final approval discussion. Daniel learned about that afterward. Somehow, her refusal to influence the decision meant more to him than influence ever could have. Now he waited inside the restaurant with Sophie, wearing a navy jacket Sophie insisted made him look less like somebody's accountant. "She is 4 minutes late," Sophie announced. "People can be 4 minutes late. You check your watch when you are nervous." Daniel lowered his wrist. "I am not nervous." Sophie gave him the same look Rebecca used during meetings when someone presented an obviously weak argument. "You two are becoming dangerously similar," he muttered. The door opened. Rebecca stepped inside wearing a simple cream sweater beneath a dark coat, with none of the formal armor Daniel associated with the office. Sophie immediately waved. Rebecca smiled and walked toward them. "Sorry. Traffic." "Dad was not worried," Sophie said. "Thank you," Daniel replied dryly. Rebecca sat across from them. For a moment, all three seemed aware that this dinner was different. There were no investors, no executives, no misunderstanding to hide behind. Sophie broke the silence first. "Are we pretending again?" Rebecca looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at Rebecca. A month earlier, that question would have made both of them uncomfortable. Tonight, it made Rebecca smile. "I hope not," she said. Daniel leaned back slightly. "Not tonight." Sophie nodded with satisfaction and opened her menu. "Good." Pretending was exhausting. Rebecca laughed. Dinner unfolded without performance. They argued gently over appetizers. Sophie told Rebecca about a science project. Daniel complained that Rebecca had encouraged Sophie to use color-coded spreadsheets for household chores. Rebecca defended herself by calling it operational efficiency. By dessert, Sophie was laughing so hard she nearly forgot about the chocolate cake in front of her. Later, outside beneath the soft glow of the restaurant lights, Sophie walked several steps ahead toward Daniel's car. Rebecca stopped beside him. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel smiled. "That depends." She looked through the window at Sophie, who was making faces at her reflection. Then Rebecca looked back at Daniel. Her voice became quieter. "Why does this feel real?" Daniel did not answer immediately. A month ago, he might have searched for the safest response. But some truths deserve the dignity of being spoken plainly. Maybe because nobody is watching anymore. Rebecca held his gaze. There was no boardroom confidence in her expression now, only hope and uncertainty. And what happens when people start watching? Daniel looked toward Sophie, then back at her. "We do not perform for them." Rebecca smiled slowly. "That sounds difficult." "Probably. And complicated." "Definitely." She laughed. Daniel opened the passenger door for her. "Still interested?" Rebecca looked at the open door, then at the man beside it, then at the little girl waiting inside the car. Yes. Daniel nodded. Then we start with another dinner. Rebecca got into the car, and Sophie immediately began explaining where they should go next Friday. Daniel walked around to the driver's side with a quiet smile. There was no miracle waiting in an envelope, no grand reward, no promise that life would suddenly become easy. There was only something better. 3 people choosing honesty after beginning with a lie, respect after misunderstanding, and possibility after loneliness. Sometimes grace arrived loudly. Sometimes redemption changed everything in a single moment. But sometimes second chances simply pulled up an extra chair, shared an imperfect meal, and stayed.